Bonjour tout le monde. Moi, je m'appelle Alanna Thain. Je suis un prof à McGill. Je dirige Moving Image Research Lab et je remercie Joël et Martha de m'avoir invité pour faire ce format inhabituel. It's a format that Joël and Martha suggested to do a collective analysis of a scene. And I really like the idea because I think when I think about what queer TV is, I think of it as collective forms of thinking and collective forms of acting. And I think it's one of the ways in which, if we're going to think about not just what queer TV is, but what queer TV does, I think it's very much about the pleasure of thinking and making together. And I say this in part because I was so lucky for my postdoc to have Lynn Joyrich as my supervisor. And I know, you're all jealous. But when I think about what, and I was mostly a cinema scholar, a cinema studies scholar at the time, but we spent a lot of Friday nights doing TV studies, watching Battlestar Galactica collectively, and then sometimes doing a vlog about it afterwards. So when I think about queer TV, I think about what it means to turn a queer eye and then to gossip about it afterwards and do all of that work of kind of filling in the blanks. So I think it's really interesting to think about how TV scholarship sits in a kind of productive relationship to everyday expertise, but also this epistemology of the console that Lynn has talked about, of a kind of pervasive televisual logic. And I've also been thinking a lot in trying to choose a clip for today about the question of pleasure. And what that means. And something else I learned from Lynn is never to apologize for something or ever call something a guilty pleasure. So I try never to do that. And instead I think about the role of pleasure and collectivity as the work of sustainability, and even in relation to a word I don't love, but it's resilience, as a kind of practice of resilience as well. So thinking about that, I've chosen for our exercise today the opening scene of a series called Pose. How many of you have seen Pose? Really? Okay, good. We're going to see the opening scene, and then you're all going to want to go home and watch it tonight. So it's kind of interesting to me that you haven't seen it before. I've never done this kind of format before. I'm going to try not to make it too pedagogical. I was at the Society for Cinema and Media Studies conference recently, and at a roundtable led by Lisa Nakamura and Kara Keeling and Wendy Chun and Tara McPherson. They spoke for about 40 minutes, and then they said, now we're all going to break into groups, and everybody got up and left. So I asked Marta and Joël to lock the door, so you all have to stay for this exercise. And I'm going to suggest that if we do it again, we do it as a 5 à 7 with wine as well. But for today, we'll very soberly watch the first 10 minutes of the series Pose. In the conversation this morning, we talked about the kind of trope in TV studies and cinema studies and media studies more generally of good versus bad representation, and in particular the limits of good representations where everything seems too positive, too joyful, that excludes all of the negative. And I've thought about that with Pose, which certainly has fairy tale qualities to it, in part drawn from its relation to the musical form. So a TV show that it gets compared to is something like Fame, for instance. It's also interestingly been compared to shows like Full House, right? This kind of family sitcom as well. I think it was a sitcom. I've actually never seen Full House. But thinking about Pose's pleasure, I think, is actually something political to think about in the contemporary moment. That, and particularly for a show that sits very much at the nexus of queer lives, trans lives, and racialized lives as well, and has brought a lot of questions about the economics of production, for example, the economics of visibility and the viability of visibility to the screen in a different ways, in a way that I think also pushes in some ways our concept of what queer TV might be in relationship to a project that is really foregrounded, not simply trans bodies on screen as characters, but as actors, producers, writers, directors, thoroughly integrated into every part of the process as well. I wanted to think about the value of positive representation, the value of TV shows where filling in the gap might not be a kind of wistful or desiring filling in of imagined pleasures that might be occurring off screen, but where filling in the gap might be bringing some of the knowledge of things like the intense violence that trans lives and queer lives are facing increasingly in the contemporary moment. So I think there's a kind of value to a show like Pose, and I picked it because it makes me feel really, really, really good, and I hope you guys will all have a chance to enjoy it as well. So I thought what we could do is to watch the first 10 minutes together. It's a long clip, but I think you'll see why we have to watch all 10 minutes. And to think about what it means for this show to announce itself as a queer kind of intervention in a certain way. And then I thought maybe we could break into small groups, talk for a little bit, and then come back together and talk collectively about what it would mean to produce a collective analysis of this scene. Before we begin, if everybody has something to write on, or you can even just think about this and remember it. So most of you haven't seen Pose, but I'd like you to think for just a minute about what you know about Pose as a TV series. Like, what knowledge do you have going into this? Whether it's anything at all, what's it about, who made it, who's behind it, when did it air, anything at all, any kind of form of knowledge that you have. And as part of that question, I'd like you just to take a minute to think about the question, what's queer about Pose, in as much as you know what's going on with it. Alors, est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un qui a besoin de traduction? Non, ça va? OK, c'est beau. So we'll watch it and then we'll break into groups. I'll maybe ask you guys to not sit with the person that you came with for the groups, but we'll see what happens. Okay.
My roots, it just looks like it feeling. Why are you conversing on matters so banal? For 10 years, the House of Abundance has reigned supreme. But last week, Pendarvis stole our trophy. Focus, children. It is time we remind the world who we are. What category should we walk? Superhero. Why did you just give Mother a Sonics instead?
Royalty. But we should all walk it together. All of the house children.
What are we gonna do? Run down to Burger King and get some paper crowns? Shush, children, and let your mother speak. I know what we're going to do.
She is the mother of invention. And this is where the goodness comes from.
We will walk together as the Royal House of Abundance.
I love that. Oh, no, wait, hold on a minute. That's the third time this week you've taken my idea as your own, and these bitches are going along with it. What's the difference between walking royalty and walking as the Royal House of Abundance?
Just because you have an idea does not mean you know how to properly execute it. Ideas are ingredients. Only a real mother knows how to prepare them.
Real, you hear that, cross-dresser? I'm going there and finish cooking. The bitch is hungry.
them a pretty good idea where they're headed.
How do you even put this shit on?
Royalty. The category is Bring It Like Royalty. Yeah, you own everything. Everything is yours. You own your beauty. You own your country. You own your name. You own the I don't know of a princess or a queen who gets their clothes from tangible gold. It's all right. Either effort. Please turn to the judges. Please turn to the judges. Turn around. We have a 6. We have a 10. We have a 6. We have a 6. The shade. The shade of law.
Absolutely useless. Remove yourself.
Unfortunately, you are dismissed. Bye-bye. See ya. Give them a hand. Anyone else? Going once, twice, 3 times a lady. Anyone else? And the house of a cousin has impressed the building. Bringing realness to being paint. Bringing pigment and corsets and ripple and circles and crowns. Oh my! Disney washed over ass. Cinderella is in town. They're giving wands. They're giving prince and princess realness. Look at the prince. Yes, live, Lord Jesus. Listen and learn. Yes, more pretty, more And where's the queen? Where's the one and only? Alexa. The queen is giving a ball. The queen is giving a ball. Oh, yes! The category is
OK. C'est vraiment la fun. Alors, peut-être, on peut faire des petits groupes. Je vais peut-être rejouer les scènes sans son, juste en background. On va prendre peut-être 10 à 15 minutes pour discuter, puis on revient tous ensemble. So we'll break into small groups of maybe like 3. Think about the scene, think about what you noticed, what jumped out at you, what's interesting, what's surprising maybe, what's not surprising. And then we'll come back together and talk about it collectively. Does that sound good? Okay. And like I said, you know, maybe go find someone you're not sitting next to. Cool.
Non, on coupe ça.
C'est bon pour tout le monde? On peut tous ensemble entendre? OK. Alors, je ne sais pas si quelqu'un...
Alors, on a richesse, opulence, choc. On a aussi qualité. On peut formuler aussi du... Je pense qu'on avait surtout vu l'espèce de... Premièrement, bon, les références explicites à Paris is Burning.
C'est sûr.
On s'est aussi demandé à quel point ce sera accessible à quelqu'un qui n'a pas vu Paris is Burning. Je ne sais pas ce que vous en pensez.
En fait, c'est drôle parce qu'on a discuté de question de la leçon d'histoire. Dans le sens où, justement, bon, le passage dans le musée, où est-ce que ces femmes se voient à travers ces statues, une espèce de réappropriation du corps, une espèce de visibilité de soi. Après, cette réappropriation de vêtements très coloniaux, ensuite, c'est une réappropriation de cette époque par ces femmes, mais aussi une leçon d'histoire en termes queer, justement par la mise en scène de Paris is Burning style. Puis cette espèce de... Tu sais, je veux dire, c'est impossible de ne pas penser à Paris is Burning quand on l'a vu, mais si on ne l'a pas vu, clairement, ça vient dans, mettons, dans le fandom ou dans le Twitter ou dans ce qui va venir autour de la série qui va diriger vers Paris is Burning et peut-être revitaliser. Ben, on se posait la question, en fait, qu'est-ce qui est cité? Est-ce que c'est Paris is Burning ou est-ce que c'est la culture actuelle des bars gays? Ou est-ce qu'il y a énormément, surtout à Montréal, mais il y a une réappropriation, une remise en scène des balles que du voguing dans les bars gays, peut-être. Je vous laisse continuer, là, je ne voulais pas...
Non, mais moi, je dirais la question aux autres. Là. Je pense que c'est un monologue de chaque équipe. Là, mais
justement, dans la même direction, on avait aussi parlé du fait justement de cette réappropriation-là de la culture coloniale qui se veut, parce que comme on avait parlé, on ne sait plus trop comment ça s'appelle, quand du mopping, quand tu prends les vêtements pour les prendre, sauf que là, au lieu d'être justement une boutique de vêtements qui se vit dans une sorte de culture contemporaine, on va voler des pièces qui se veulent être de la culture, ça va être plutôt être dans un musée où là, la culture se veut morte, déjà un peu enterré par la cage du musée. Puis là, on vient l'arracher un peu. Fait que justement, je vois vraiment ce report transhistorique-là qui se vient dans la scène du musée.
Nous, on a parlé aussi d'une certaine irritation queer qui, du point de vue cinématographique, je l'interprète, va dans le sens aussi d'un lien intertextuel qui marque aussi la qualité de la série, qui veut se déclarer comme série de qualité et qui peut aller jusqu'à cette course dans le musée qui, moi, ça m'a évoqué bande à part. C'était vraiment de déstabiliser quelque chose, mais aussi dans le cinéma qui veut déstabiliser des normes. Et ici, une série qui veut, en jouant sur des travelling, mais sur des travelling quand même qui sont très, quand même presque choquants les uns contre les autres. C'est pas des travelling qui nous amènent dans un monde d'une façon très linéaire. Au contraire, ça continue, voilà, ici par exemple. Mais ça continue, mais ça choque avec un autre. Puis il n'y a pas de plan fixe, on est toujours en mouvement. Et Christophe parlait d'irritation pure, c'est très intéressant. Pour cette déstabilisation des normes, cette irritation aussi du public qui pourrait réagir, soit dans un élan, soit aussi quand même dans un geste de défense ou de retrait.
Est-ce que je peux poser quelques questions, peut-être? Qu'est-ce que vous avez pensé du travail avec le corps? Parce que c'est surtout comme quelque chose de spécial, un regard spécial sur le corps queer, mais aussi le corps trans. Et je crois que, par exemple, les traveling, je ne sais pas si on peut voir un exemple, mais quand ils rentrent dans le musée, there's like a big movement in the space, into bodies, out of bodies. It's always putting the relation between body and space into question, the destabilization. But it's always kind of moving into the body and then reclaiming the space through those bodies. I'm curious what you thought of the way that bodies were being shown and explored in this scene. Any thoughts?
Moi, je trouve que la scène avec les bustes, toutes ces choses-là qui est particulièrement intéressante sur l'espèce de dysphorie qu'on associe typiquement à la communauté, aux communautés marginalisées, aux communautés queer. Aussi avec le fait qu'il y ait ou pas la vitre autour de l'objet pour représenter s'il est accessible ou pas. Comme par exemple, la personne qui est le plus opprimée du groupe va avoir une espèce de caisson où elle va voir le corps dans lequel elle se reconnaît le plus. sous la pression. Fait que là, c'est encore plus loin du corps. Fait que ce personnage, je pense que c'est plus loin du corps, mais par exemple, tu vas avoir la reine qui va même aller toucher le visage, qui va avoir un contact plus direct. Fait que j'ai vraiment, c'est ça. Voilà.
Alors, tu as pris ces moments de reconnaissance comme dysphorie d'une certaine façon?
Pas une dysphorie, mais une reconnaissance.
Une reconnaissance, c'est sûr, c'est sûr.
D'un idéal corporel, qu'on peut appeler dysphorie,
Mhm.
non, qu'est-ce que tu veux dire.
Ou même peut-être euphorie d'une certaine façon, d'avoir ce moment de reconnaissance dans une espace comme le musée aussi. OK, intéressant. C'est magnifique, hein?
Ben, je trouvais qu'il y avait un aspect, or I thought there was a very camp aspect
C'est sûr.
to like everything that sort of starts from what the ball culture was, but extends to how the camera is used, the music, the different types of characters. What happens? They win, and even when the police comes, they just whatever, we'll do it anyway. So there's this very camp aspect that works with the feeling good that you were talking about, where like even though we know that these persons feel very hard things in life, I don't think anybody starting the first episode is in any sort of illusion about that, but we see them win, we see them celebrated. I don't know, it works with the camp. But, should I say as well for the
There was something also about the power relations, and that's something that we've discussed, the fact that there's this, well, it's a spectacular performance that ends with like we have spoilers, so we know that.
It's like 5 minutes later.
Okay, 5 minutes later, we learned that there were not real, like the museum's not gonna sue them for stealing the clothes because they don't want people to know that it's easy to steal stuff, basically. So they know it. So the arrest is part of the performance. It's part of having them being recognized as royalty, being like this superpower. But then, again, the power structure of the police, the white police officers, the white male police officers coming in to arrest black trans women, are reproduced inside the ballroom, inside this idea of having the judges using humiliation as an act of performance as well. And like in the houses as well, the mother is reigning over her children, and this kind of reinforces norms basically all over again.
Est-ce que les policiers font partie du spectacle?
Yeah.
Are they in drag as well?
Are they in drag?
Does it put their performance into question?
Yeah, we talked about a lot of that stuff too, in terms of, again, the power dynamics of the family and the way that the program, in some ways it is so familial, as TV is always familial, but again, really changes what we mean by family in terms of it. And again, I hope this doesn't spoil, but you see at some point too a guy who gets kicked out of his family of birth that then joins the house, and it ends up being sort of follows competition between these different families, all of which do have their own power structures. It's not like they're just utopian spaces, but yet it does also show the different ideas of what family can be. I'm really sorry about my horrible language skills, so I feel like when people were speaking in French, I maybe get like every fourth word, so I kind of know what you're talking about, but not what you're saying. And so I'm probably going to reiterate what people just said, but we were also talking about how the kind of self-reflexivity, even when about the idea of what does it mean to appropriate culture. So it starts with them going in and appropriating. Was this exactly what you guys were saying? Appropriating in a way like from, the most sort of dominant for them. But also these moments, like I think it's when they go and they see the art, and especially when that one kind of reaches out and touches the one that, this sense of like how people identify with things, and the meaningfulness for people of identification, even as then they mess around with it, right, and change it as this does. Probably it was also said, but I think it's interesting in post, like when you said what's queer about it, right, everything, I think, like, because of the way that it is, we're kind of on the border of the mainstream and the normative, but also I think like from its production through the text, through its reception. So the fact that it is Ryan Murphy, directing it. And again, I would always want to question a simple notion of authorship, but I don't think it's meaningless. And then produced by Nina Jacobson and Brad Simpson, people I mentioned when I was talking, that are mainstream producers, but put out a lot of things that really, I mean, they're the ones who also produce Crazy Rich Asians and American Horror Story and Assassination of Gianni Versace and the O.J. Simpson one. I think that they try to do interesting things around race and gender and sexuality and class within the mainstream. But then, importantly, I think it's really important to note that Ryan Murphy insisted on getting Janet Mock to be a producer on it, so that there was a black trans woman, you know, who worked in the production. So I think that's important. And then the text, I think, does tons of interesting things, and then its reception is incredibly interesting. I think that one of the things I was saying too, that again, I've watched the whole series, so I'm spoiled, but if anybody was watching, I mean, the way it plays with affect, I think, is really interesting, because there's moments that are just so joyous, and then there's other moments that are devastating, and they come very quickly. It's not the usual rhythm of affect. It really like kind of ricochets you between the kind of really celebratory, not, you know, or pleasure, and then horrific pain, and as a way to try to come to terms with the AIDS crisis and the way that especially hit black, trans, queer communities. The way it plays with affect, I think, is something also really interesting about this program.
Yeah. Just to go back to your point about the kind of behind the scenes, it's not simply that, also, I mean, it's not just that there's one sort of black trans woman with a voice in the situation either. For the casting, they auditioned for about 6 months, and for most of the actors, the main actors, it's one of the first times they've ever been in a TV show or even in front of the camera as an actor as well. And Janet Mock also served as a director, as a writer. There was a whole way in which it was also tied to a sort of equity in media program called HALF. So there was a very deliberate attempt to get people into positions of authority and power at every level of the production as well, which I think is quite extraordinary and really shows, I think, in the final product as well, precisely around the way that it plays with affect, where there are so many moments that are really devastating and very hard, but they're maybe not the moments you expect. I think the AIDS crisis is something that's dealt with in a way that I think we can expect, but questions of the kind of incredibly high rates of violence against black trans women who have a life expectancy of 35 years, right? So the way in which a show sets up certain expectations that would be very exploited in other shows. Florian, you were talking about The Haunting of American Horror Story. To me, like this show, which uses New York as a set, it's haunted by things like Law and Order, for example, right, as a kind of intertext. And so you're sort of expecting and dreading all of these things to happen, and they don't happen. And they don't happen in the way that you expect. There are conversations, often in place of scenes of violence, which I find hugely unusual, actually, and which for me makes the series really worth watching as well.
I have a question maybe for people who have seen the show. Are all of the characters trans?
No.
No. And the actors either, right?
All of the actors playing trans characters are trans actors, as far as I know. Yeah.
And I think the actors playing queer characters mostly. Well, not all, but yeah. It's, I mean, it also puts people in wider context.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a character who literally works for Trump Organization in it too.
Yeah.
So it does.
It's
also
so interesting.
Sort of bring in like how, again, as I was trying to say, like that. It's probably not surprising that I'm hoping to write about the show, given the way I kind of myself bring those things together. But so in a way, it does show the normative, but it shows the perverse within the normative, and in a way, it shows the normative within the perverse. But in its both plot lines and its casting, so it's not all, you know. But all and in the behind the scenes. I do think it's extraordinary, like how many people in the production itself, that it really got an enormous diversity. And I don't think personally, I know this is controversial, but I don't think that trans characters always need to be played by trans actors, or that, you know, one can only write about something that's your quote unquote own experience, because I don't even know what that term, your own experience, means. Like, we are as unconscious of our own experiences as others. So I wouldn't want to make a direct one-to-one connection. But nonetheless, I also don't think authorship is meaningless. I think it really matters. And I talked before, this is really, nobody should listen to me on this because I know it's my pet peeve, but I really don't like Transparent. And one of the things that drives me crazy about Transparent is Jill Soloway's discourse as like, she's the one person in the world who can change the world, right? But also these statements that she'll make, or even that before Jeffrey Tambor made about, like things like, we hope this is the last TV program ever to have a non-trans person play a trans person. Like that statement was made by both Tambor, like I hope I'm the last, cis person to play trans character, or Jill Soller is like, we hope we'll be the last show that has to do that, as if they're not involved in the production. Like they really felt that. Jill Soller was the showrunner. If she really felt that way, she could have cast a trans actor, right? Or if Jeffrey Tambor really felt that way, he could have quit his job and they could have hired to. Like they act like they're totally removed from the power of their own production, which is insane. So that discourse sort of drives me crazy. Whereas I felt like with this, Ryan Murphy was like, I'm giving over my power. I'm going to hire, other people to direct and write, and they get the credit, and and I feel like it's a different relationship to thinking about not only the power dynamics seen in the show, but behind the show and the creation of the show.
I think it's an interesting way of, we always talk about like using your privilege to lift other people.
Yeah.
I think it's a good example from what you're saying. I mean, I haven't read anything on it myself, but I think it's a really good example of maybe this idea of using your privilege for something good by giving space to, people who might not have as much as you do.
Yeah.
And Ryan Murphy talks about that a lot, but he also talks about what it took for him to get to a position where that was possible for him as well. So I think that's also interesting to think about. Sometimes it seems like he's making a million TV shows, but it seems like it's worth it if it's going to produce a kind of spin-off as well.
And it is true, he's way more privileged than Jill Soloway, so I should not rag on her. I'm glad she's out there, I really am.
Maybe something interesting is also about the fact that the series is aired on FX. So what about the fact that it's specific cable television, so not a network broadcast for everybody? So what about the audience that you can imagine?
And it's a small audience too, right? Like it was successful and it had enough kind of prestige attached to it and the right kind of audience in effect that even though it was relatively small and kind of built by word of mouth, it did get renewed for a second season, which is starting any day now, yay. But there is that sense too of like what shows succeed, which audiences count, and who's watching the show as well, and in what context.
It's so funny because in my head it was a mainstream show, but I guess it's just because of my network. So I
Right?
feel like it's a mainstream show, and sometimes when I pull away from that, I'm like, oh, I should consider that more. To me, it was very, and what is mainstream? I guess what can qualify as a mainstream show is another discussion we were having.
Well, I think that comes back to Joelle's point too about what is this show referring to, right? So we were like, is it Madonna, right? Which is the mainstream version of voguing that everybody's familiar with. But certainly Jenny Livingston's Paris is Burning is increasingly being received by like the kids today as a mainstream production, right? What is this white lesbian doing making a film about ballroom culture? She's exploiting people. There's been a lot of controversy around that as well. Did she make a lot of money off of her independent documentary film at that moment? And a sense of what's the historical context in which it was even possible for her to make this work as well. So, yeah. That idea of what counts as mainstream and that historical perspective needed to see that as well is very interesting.
I mean, I think it both, because FX it's not one of sort of the big four networks, but it still is a regular cable network, commercial cable network. So again, it's not the same as like AJ Christian's Open TV and his trans productions, but I do think it's, it's in a kind of, it's like on the margins of the mainstream, if that makes sense. And I don't know, I mean now, isn't it that Ryan Murphy signed an exclusive deal, I think, with Netflix? So now, which again, so that's already going to narrow an audience. Well, I guess it depends on whether you think of Netflix as narrowing to people who pay for it, or broadening, because these days a lot of people are, of course, cord cutting. So I don't know, but I think that whole, that's again, this whole thing about getting an exclusive deal is sort of weird, but yeah. But with the Jenny Livingston, again, like there is now these debates about, oh, but she made a documentary not about her own community. What's one's own community? There's lots of ways we can define community, and I think Jenny Livingston certainly thought of herself as part of a queer community. I think people say that because, of course, of being a white woman, mostly filming men of color, right, or trans women of color. And I think, again, this is a topic for another day, but I think that the different status that the way televisuality treats race from its early history as the mark of the real in a way that it does not treat gender. And I think it does tie to again, early TV history, even staking its claim as a new medium that was important because it could bring real live news, right, and that it was real, but did that by staking its claim by filming the civil rights movement, particularly black bodies being beaten up, so that there was, from early on, this association with the mark of the real is the vulnerable black body. So I do think that, but again, I think we can't take those, the way television defines certain things as real or phantasmatic or either performative or authentic, like we have to question those instead of just buying into it, I think.
How are we doing on time?
Well, still like 10 minutes if you want to keep going.
I have a question. When you talked about a bit about you were talking right now about Paris is Burning, and you just said, the kids today are starting to see Paris is Burning.
Sorry, I'm getting so old,
That's actually fine, because I'm wondering, I have no shame in saying this. I was not aware of Paris is Burning before I watched RuPaul's Drag Race. Because I'm one of the kids. But I'm wondering how much we can tie in Pose with the rise in popularity of RuPaul's Drag Race and drag culture in general becomes pretty much mainstream now, and how we can see this, a big network, not one of the top 4, but still pretty big, signing a show about drag culture and trans women, and I don't know if it's really about drag culture because I haven't seen it, but it seems to me like it's related to it. So I'm wondering if we can see maybe like a link between these two phenomena.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you have your hand up? No. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that comes back to this question also of mainstreaming, right? What is the way in which it appears? And again, I think I'm just obsessed with Lynn's work on Donald Trump, but because Trump Tower is actually the site of employment for a character in the show, and it plays a kind of, it's the margin in a certain way, but it's also the margin that keeps informing so many moments in the show that I think it's inseparable to think about this kind of reality TV culture that is, again, so pervasive, but also to think about the limits of RuPaul's Drag Race, which is itself this kind of cult phenomenon, which has created massive viewing communities as well. These kind of collective cultures renewed the act of, maybe not renewed, but I kind of think renewed the act of watching things together, especially with the kind of spin-off shows that's part of reality TV culture more generally, the live traveling shows as well. But it's also, again, as we touched on this morning, one of the limits of RuPaul's show, right, which is very much about drag culture. And this show goes in a different direction. There is certainly drag culture to an extent. It's obviously part of the ballroom scene, but I think it goes well beyond the idea of gender drag that I think is already there in Paris is Burning, that I think kind of gets forgotten as that film gets filtered maybe through Butler's work and then taken up just in relation just to gender. So I think the question of how race comes back, how class comes back in a critical way is really, really important as well. Yeah, so that there's still something about the reality TV model of like, you can make yourself into anything, and it's very individual. There's a winner, right? Even though there's all this kind of community as well. But in this show, the only way you're going to win is together. And over again, that's kind of underlined. So it brings the question of family into play in a different moment. Even the opening is all very much about the house, right? The space of the collective home. The museum is this sort of stolen site that they're then kind of occupying after hours with this song, In My House, playing over and over again. And then the way that the museum, for like a moment when the lights go out, it becomes the ballroom, right? It becomes like a prefiguration of the ballroom, which is then repeatedly described as a home, a site of family throughout the series too. So it's interesting to think about the differences between sort of collective and individual forms of success.
I think also the references to Drag Race are maybe a way to include people who have seen that but maybe haven't seen Paris is Burning, or like sort of une perche que les gens peuvent attraper puis sort of get into it. C'est comme quand le personnage de Billy Porter dit the shade of it all. It's like a very common RuPaul Drag Race phrase. I also think when you mentioned earlier about the violence in Pose, I haven't seen the whole season, so I don't know all that happens. But I know that in Paris is Burning, it occupies a space, especially with the death of Venus, I think was her name, where like it doesn't seem like it's a subject they wanted to talk about first of all, but it happens and they sort of have to talk about it. So I don't know, the sort of violence that's there, but that's not shown. Maybe there's a little.
Yeah, I think there's something, I mean, the other thing I'll say about like my students today is they're so tired when I teach classes on queer media, for example, like they are exhausted watching movies about queer people and trans people dying, killing themselves, being murdered. Like they've had it. They've had it. It's so violent to do that in the class, and I'm so happy that there's other stuff coming out now that we don't have to, I mean, it's important to talk about, it's important to think about how that's represented, it's important to think about the work that it's done, but when that's the entirety of the canon, right, it's a very different kind of experience working with that. And so I'm really happy that there's works like Pose coming out, which, like I said, don't shy away from the really everyday structural forms of violence, the everyday kind of encounters, but also says, like, actually it doesn't always have to end this way. So there's very interesting encounters between the trans women in the show and straight men and straight women, for example. There's things that would be scenes of rivalry and jealousy and attack that turn into scenes of collaboration and collective kind of rerouting of affect as well, which I encourage you to watch to find out. So it's just interesting to think about that utopian dimension of the show, which doesn't have to deny the kind of violence that happens, but that is speculative and utopian and forward-looking in the sense of asking, like, how else could this be? Like, how else could this thing that could go down so horribly, how else could this go? That I think is super interesting in the show. Mm-hmm.
You consider the family in Pose as utopian? Or did I misunderstood something?
Well, I think I always think of like the utopian in Munoz's sense, both about a kind of refusal of the here and now, but also I think of it as an imminent form of utopia. So it's always like, what have we got? What are we making do with in a certain way? And I think, yeah, absolutely. It's quite utopian, actually. But it's also very pragmatic, too, right?
Yeah, it's a real mix, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that it shows utopian longings. It also shows how, in a way, they always fall short, but that doesn't mean you don't have longings anymore, that you should give them up, right? I think it shows that. And there are sort of horrible violences and power dynamics and reproductions of sort of the worst kinds of hierarchies, but on the other hand, that's not the only thing, and they're not separable from the other moments. So in a way, it's the collision of all of them that for me is so, in a way, interesting, I think, about the show.
Yeah. And I think, too, there's a way in which the show asks us to do some of the work of bringing our history. So we started by saying, is this show accessible if you've never seen Paris is Burning, right? Well, I think one of the demands the show makes on us, even though it does give us a lot of history lessons in a certain way, and RuPaul's Drag Race does that too, right? Where does this come from? Where does that come from? You know, how do we have these casual conversations that are actually mini history lessons? The show does some of that, but it kind of makes a demand on us to remember that there was this AIDS crisis, right? And it's incredible. I mean, they actually call this period, I mean, we've kind of come into a new moment, but there was this period in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s of like the great forgetting, the great amnesia, that there was an AIDS crisis. And instead, it just puts that into the fabric of what you're looking at. And so the onus is on us as viewers, which I think is quite utopian, right? It actually makes a kind of demand of us to know something and to remember. I like that.
Just to be irritating, I would like to raise maybe the limits of such an analysis. I love it, but methodologically, when you think about studying a TV series or analyzing a TV series, only starting with a fragment. So the fact that most of us haven't watched the whole series is our analysis. Does it have a sense or not?
Well, I think it's just a realist analysis because most of us won't know some of the thing in life. Other will know all of the thing in life, and after that, how we communicate those things and how we exchange on those ideas is realistic. So I think this is pretty realistic methodology.
And I think we also complement each other's, ideas well.
I think we all can.
Yeah, no, but
I think what Martha means,
I love it.
No, Martha's like passion is about world making and time and seriality, right?
Yes.
And then we don't have it because we're stuck to the fragment.
Exactly. So it's fascinating. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
But for example, you mentioned the fact that 5 minutes after
Yes.
you discover something that
But
we
what
don't know.
about-
So how can we?
But what about seriality when it comes to like 1991 Paris is Burning and Pose? Like how can we see this as a seriality and a world building and time, like
And can we put in the same series, this series, American Horror Story, other
like
series?
you mean Ryan Murphy's
Universe.
As we said. Or,
Universe, yeah.
And anybody can make his own series.
Mais en même temps, il s'agit des 10 premières minutes d'un épisode qui sont censées être l'introduction de la série. On peut s'attendre avec ces 10 premières minutes d'avoir finalement une présentation de certains des thèmes principaux de la série.
Peut-être dans une perspective narrative.
Voilà, si on se limitait vraiment à l'action elle-même, on serait limité, mais là, la discussion a tourné beaucoup autour des thèmes de réappropriation de certains symboles et tout ça, et on peut s'attendre, justement, on est dans une house avec le mother et tout, on peut s'attendre peut-être à ce que ça soit une analyse qui pourrait avoir beaucoup de sens pour le reste de l'épisode de la saison, je sais. J'ai pas vu.
Presque même renverser la question, c'est-à-dire se demander si finalement il n'y a pas quelque chose d'abstrait à étudier les séries télévisées dans leur intégralité, comme si l'ensemble des publics avaient vu les séries télévisées dans leur intégralité. C'est-à-dire, on peut aussi, quand on part des pratiques réelles, on part aussi d'épisodes devant lesquels les gens se sont endormis. On prend en compte aussi les formes de conscience intellectuelle. Voilà, comme on prend en compte les arrêts. Il y a plein de gens qui ont regardé ces 10 premières minutes qui se sont arrêtés. Voilà. Et là, il se trouve que
Or that we want to
collectivement, on a
study
fait
a
ça.
series that is not completed.
Mais maintenant, le problème, c'est qu'on n'a pas étudié une série. On a étudié un extrait avec une problématique qui n'était pas liée à la série entière. On n'a pas eu la prétention pour. Si on avait, we didn't analyze a series. We just analyzed one scene, one excerpt, and our question was not analyzing the whole series. So I think you would be right. We didn't have an analysis about the whole show because we hadn't seen it.
Just
Couldn't
about
be values, but what we did was just take an excerpt and looking from that. So
And we had a conversation about what makes this excerpt queer.
yeah, it was more about maybe representation or maybe what is queerness, just getting an impulse from something.
But there is a way in which television is always in fragments, right? That going back to early flow, so there is a way in which just seeing a fragment is so televisual, but then there's also how TV always, there's more and more and more, and whether it's like, whatever the whole would it mean like the whole series, would it mean all the intertext, would it mean all the fan reading? But one of the things that's sort of interesting that I think we kind of embodied is like, we see like TV comes to you in fragments, and then you're like initiated by other people, right? So there's which often happens, I think, with TV, right? People's friends watch something, and then they're like, oh, you gotta see this, and there is a kind of queer initiation that goes on, I think, with certain texts, and this, I think, is one that we, that it spreads in a way, and so I think we kind of did that ourselves, like, because everyone's now gonna go watch it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I really appreciate it as a way to think of not just narrative and character development, which is what so much queer reading is of just narrative and character development, but looking at just one scene has like provoked us to think about the actual aesthetics of production and how do those actually align with the content. So we kind of have a marriage of form and content here in terms terms of kind of this queer affect, and especially even like these haptic moments where the character reaches out, touches the statue, and it's like we feel it because not just because she touches it, she brings it back to her own body, right? So yeah, especially as someone who cares about aesthetics and production.
Could I also then ask a methodological question? Because it was really fun. But I'm a real formalist in a lot of the work that I do. And when I work with students with cinema, I often like to show a clip. If we watch it, we'll watch it with the sound off, we'll watch it with the picture off. And I think this clip would have been really fun to watch to just listen to the sound, actually. Especially because so often with Netflix, I find myself, like my browser's open and I'm just listening.
That's what I was going to say. I'm a gamer, so I often play games on my computer and then have like a show on TV, so I don't really watch it. I hear it. So I think that would be very interesting. We had a similar conversation about watching it with only the image, and that's how we kind of like saw the travelings. Non-stop travelings. That's how we saw it, because it wasn't as obvious when we watched it with the sound, because we were hearing also the cuts. But then watching it with no sound, we're like, oh, it's just like constant travelings. There's no like, I don't have the vocabulary in English for movie stuff, but just like the plan fixe. So there was none of them, and that's how we saw it. So I think it would have been very useful to watch it with only sound as well.
Yeah. Okay, good, because I would like to do that. If I was doing it again, I would just take 30 minutes and watch it like 3 different ways.
Par exemple, quand la police rentrait, avec la texte, on voyait clairement le switch, ça c'était fixe. Quand il déguisait la vitre aussi, il y avait des plans fixes. Il y avait quelques plans fixes dans des moments plus légaux, on avait plus qui se situent en dehors. Oui, un peu l'impression que bon. Donc il y a des normes.
Le dialogue dans la maison, tout plan fixe, séparé.
Ça, je m'en rappelle pas du début, mais ça peut bien.
Mais je pense aussi qu'avec l'exercice de l'extrait, c'est sûr qu'on peut débattre sur les petites choses, l'intertextualité, qu'est-ce qui suit après. Mais je pense que ce qui est important, c'est aussi comment ça nous a fait sentir, ce qui est un peu comment vous avez posé la question, parce que c'est des sentiments qui reviennent dans la série. Quand tu gagnes, puis t'es comme, wow, c'est comme un avant-goût de comme, il y en a d'autres qui arrivent, continue de regarder. Et je pense que comme, la réception émotionnelle rentre là-dedans aussi.
C'est sûr, c'est sûr. Merci. Dernier point, dernière intervention. Hey, merci, super Eddie.
Thank you so much for